Hey everybody, welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable, a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk about Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. The standard disclaimer applies. The thoughts and opinions expressed right here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not represent any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Make sure you keep your conversations open for the public and on the level. To interact with us live on the show or even afterwards, send questions and comments to our Twitter page at Mason Roundtable or on the Facebook page for episode 161, The History of Freemasonry in Russia. You know me, my name is John Ruark, past master of the Patriot Lodge number 1957 in Fairfax, Virginia. And I'll hand it off to Jason Richards.
Hey everybody, Jason Richards here, Worshipful Master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, and member of the Colonial Lodge number 1821 in the District of Columbia.
And some other stuff. Good stuff.
Stuff and things.
Hey, all the dues. And last but not least, our guest host tonight, Mike the Intern. Welcome back.
Hey everyone, Mike Hambrick, Village Lodge number 274 in Burton, Ohio.
Beard's looking good, man.
Thanks.
Keep it going. It's getting warm though, so might be time.
Oh yeah.
All right, let's switch over to first item of Masonic news. You guessed it. The 300th anniversary of Freemasonry is this year, June 23rd and 24th to be exact. And you too can join us at 300 Freemasonry's Legacy, Freemasonry's Future. An unconference, as it were. This is not your grandfather's Masonic gathering. We are meeting at Alexandria, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., at the house, not the House of the Temple, the other one, the other cool building, the George Washington Masonic Memorial, which is a national landmark. And we will
be having a historic landmark. Even.
It is a historic landmark now, exactly. We'll be having a day full of topics and breakout sessions, very interactive. And so, be there and be square. We've posted hotel room information on the page, and also it is April now, so the prices have gone up. So if you don't want to delay any longer, they will go up again before June comes around. To get more details and to get the latest tickets, go to themasonicroundtable.com/300. Hope to see you there. Next in Masonic news is another thing that Mike found for us. Mike, do you want to talk about the Fort Collins Masonic Temple?
Yeah. Let's see. That was in Colorado. There were some upside down crosses spray painted in black on the Masonic Temple there, and now the police in the area are actually investigating it as a hate crime because they said that any vandalism that is on any religious or cultural meeting place can be investigated as a hate crime.
See, I think that's really interesting too for a couple of reasons. I think it's the first time that I'm aware of that it's actually been labeled anywhere as a hate crime for any vandalism toward Freemasonry in general. So that's an interesting thing to note. Here's actually a zoomed in version of some of the damage. It was also spray painted on the steps that Great Tribulation is at hand. Now, being a fan of symbolism, right? Masonry does that to you. I've always found it interesting that people would use the upside down crucifix as a satanic symbol or some sort of, negative connotation, when actually, the
sign of distress.
Well, there you go. But even Peter, I believe was it Peter that was crucified upside down?
Peter was crucified upside down.
Right. So as a sign of humility, right? So it's actually a very humble symbol, and yet again, people don't really understand what the actual intent or background or history of what certain symbols mean. So they were doing us a favor by spraying upside down crosses? No, I'm not going to go that far. But, ignorance is bliss, right? There we are.
Right.
So yes, that's in Colorado, and hopefully they will catch the vandals.
Yeah.
The last piece of big news here is we mentioned a couple episodes back about the 75-year-old past Grand Provincial Grandmaster over in England or in the UK had been texting with who he thought was a 14-year-old boy, got caught, and had the negative connotation, right, of being a past grand
I
something.
think that's more than a connotation, but all right.
That's true. It just works me up. So sorry for that, because this, as I said in the episode when we talked about him, we really need to throw the book at him to make an example of him and what he does not stand for Freemasonry. And so it really grinds my gears that he's in the news again this week because he hasn't gone to jail yet. In fact, the judge that sentenced him gave him a bunch of other sentences, but not jail time. Specifically, that let me check my news here.
80 hours of unpaid work in the community.
Right.
80 whole hours.
Yes. So here's the whole sentence. Given a 16-month prison sentence, but that was suspended for 2 years. While waiting, he has to undertake a sex offenders treatment program and a 40-day rehabilitation requirement. Also, further ordered to do 80 hours of community service and has to sign the sex offender register for 10 years.
I'm sorry, this is just bull.
Yeah. There's some tinfoil hat wearing guy who's going to say, well, he got off because he's a Freemason.
Yep.
Yeah, really.
And this is just, again, it's asinine that it sounds like a large sentence, but I don't think it went far enough, obviously. The article does say he did resign irrevocably from Freemasonry December 1st, 2016.
It was nice. It would have been nicer had they just expelled him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, really.
Okay, you're done. Bye.
Bye. So long.
Don't come back. Thanks for your service. We'll be taking your jewel back.
Grandmasters have suspended or expelled people for less, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Right. So stay tuned, I guess, to see what other shenanigans this guy gets into. It's ridiculous. Hey, there's one.
He'll probably get his own reality TV show.
That's right, probably.
How about that? Juan, you want to hop in and introduce yourself now that you're here?
Dobre utra, Ivan Sepulvedov, from the Winding Stairs Freemasonry podcast, and a brother from Orange Blossom Lodge number 80 in Kissimmee, Florida.
You just told us good morning and that you were the son of Sepulveda. Patronymic is the first name. What was your father's first name?
Juan Sepulveda.
Oh, okay. So it'd be Ivanov.
Ivanov.
No, that's Ivan. Ivanov.
Sure. We'll go with that.
Unless you consider yourself to be feminine, then it'd be Wanovna.
Yeah,
I learned something.
Not today.
But
I'm masculine today.
welcome in, Juan. Let's get right to the topic then, since we're already starting to speak the language. Jason Richards has done an extensive amount of the history of Freemasonry in Russia. So strap yourselves in, boys and girls. It's going to be a wild ride. Jason, take it away, and I have your slides at the ready.
Great. Thanks, John. So back 2 episodes ago, we talked about the member of the Russian Duma, which is their equivalent of the parliament, who essentially ordered an inquiry into Freemasonry for potential illicit and non-Russian outsider activities and foreign influence. And I went on a bit of an ad hoc diatribe on Freemasonry in Russia and the history of Freemasonry in Russia. And from that, Apparently, these guys liked it so much they said, "You know what? You should actually do some research this time," and talk for about 3 times as long. So that's what we have here. So just for your edification, on my background, I've been studying Russian history and culture for the better part of a decade and a half now. I started in high school. I did a bachelor's in history, focusing specifically on Russian history, and then did a master's in Russian policy and international security. So I know my way around Russian history a little bit, and so it's been interesting, combining the two loves of my life, Russian history and Masonic history, especially early Russian history, into one. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Just to explain some introductory concepts before we dive right in. First thing you need to know is we're all subject to the limits of historical knowledge. There are going to be some things I'm going to talk about today where I'm going to say, look, this is the conventional wisdom, this is the rumor. However, we don't actually possess any historical records that back this up, or confirm it or deny it. And that's just the world in which we live. We live with imperfect information. We live with too many sources. On one hand, it's impossible to sift through them all. But then we also deal with Masonic historical sources that we're just never going to get back, because they either simply don't exist, they were destroyed, they were lost, or they're waiting to be found in some treasure trove. So that's a reality within which we find ourselves today whenever you study history, especially early Masonic history. As far as Russian history is concerned, the main theme that you need to understand that underpins everything that you're going to see in the 286 years that Freemasonry has been in Russia, at least off and on, is that Russian history is characterized very much by its relationship with the cultures, practices, and traditions of Western Europe. And that's what they referred to as the West. The Russians very much define themselves by their relationship to the West, whether they are in favor of the West and trying to modernize their society or westernize their society, or when you get into the 19th century when the Slavophile um, movement got on its feet, trying to distance itself culturally and societally from the West. And that's going to be very, very important, because Freemasonry, as we know it today, is inherently a Western institution. So you'll find that in periods of Russian history where the Russian aristocracy was trying to um, move closer to Western Europe and adopt the practices of Western Europe, that's when you see Freemasonry grow and thrive. And then you see Freemasonry wane when the aristocracy and the leadership in Russia, the Tsars and the Communist Party specifically, try to distance themselves from Europe. That's when you're going to see Freemasonry getting banned, public inquiries into Freemasonry, Freemasons meeting under the watch of the police, things of that nature. So as we go through this today, you're going to see a definite pattern of Freemasonry being successful and then being not successful in direct proportion to the Russian people's relationship, or conception of their relationship with the West. So its connection to Western Europe, as far as Freemasonry is concerned, has been both the strongest reason for Freemasonry's existence in Russia, but also its greatest detriment. So between 1731 and 1822, this is kind of the ancient golden age of Russian Freemasonry, because in 1822, as we'll see, Freemasonry is abolished. It tries to get back started a little bit in 1905, and it flourishes a little bit. And then when the Bolsheviks take over, Freemasonry is abolished again, and we have a long period of just complete and utter darkness until the fall of the Soviet Union. But between 1731 and 1822, that's kind of the early golden age of Freemasonry in Russia. And you have to understand that Russian Freemasonry went through 3 distinct phases during this time period. Starting in 1731 and up to about the mid 1760s, early 1760s, Freemasonry was really a product by foreigners for foreigners. So you had a bunch of foreigners who brought Freemasonry to the country, and we'll talk a little bit about that more later, especially as we get into Peter the Great. But it really didn't take hold with the indigenous Russians during this time. It really was primarily just merchants and members in the Russian service, in service to the Russian Navy, especially, who were these active members of Masonic lodges. Now, starting in the excuse me, in the early reign of Catherine the Great, as we'll see in 1762, Freemasonry morphed into its own as members of the Russian aristocracy, members of the Russian intelligentsia, started joining in droves. And this is where Freemasonry really morphed from just being a simple byproduct of foreign influence on Russia to its own style of Freemasonry, really modeled after the English speculative style, which is that system of morality, again, getting to that speculative nature of Freemasonry that came about in England at 1717 at the birth of the Grand Lodge of England, and primarily working those 3 degrees. Then, getting into the 1780s, you had the higher degree mystical Masonry based heavily on Rosicrucianism. And this is where we start to see splintering factions in Freemasonry, which tend to confuse a lot of people as far as the craft is concerned. And you'll see that some of this splintering and some of this infighting between kind of, their own version of the neo-moderns and neo-ancients in Freemasonry ultimately led to its downfall and banning. So the Grand Lodge of Russia, as we know it today, was formed in 1995 after the collapse of the Soviet Union and December of 1991. But Freemasonry has existed off and on, like I've mentioned, in Russia for 286 years. But in order to set the stage for Freemasonry, we actually have to talk about one of its leaders starting in 1672, and that's Peter I, also known as Peter the Great. And he came to the throne as the Tsar of Russia, the king or regent of Russia, at age 10 in 1682, but jointly ruled with his half-brother Ivan V, who history records as chronically ill and of infirm mind until about 1696. Now, there's a legend that Peter the Great was the first Russian Mason who actually took the degrees with Christopher Wren during his travels to England. And of course, we don't have any historical information to either confirm nor deny that. However, we do know that Peter the Great traveled very, very prolifically throughout Northern Europe for the first several years of his reign, because Peter was very influenced by Western Europe and its preoccupation with the Enlightenment. So Peter saw the Russian society, which originated out of the Slav tribes and had some Mongol influences from their 13th century invasion of most of Russia. He saw that Asian influence as backwardness and a society that lacked sophistication and lacked the glorious works of science and industry that he saw in Europe. So he took it upon himself to westernize the country. Again, we're talking about, increasing your ties with the West, embracing Enlightenment philosophy, providing a fertile ground for Freemasonry to come in at some point. So in trying to modernize Russia, Peter the First or Peter the Great implemented some sweeping reforms across Russia to modernize what he felt, again, was a backward society. And those reforms included the modernization of the Russian army and the buildup of the Navy. And you'll see a lot of the first foreign Masons were foreigners who were conscripted into the Russian service, who served as officers in the Russian army and as the Russian Navy. So that modernization of the armed forces in Russia helped to provide a pretty fertile ground for Masonry as well. Peter the Great also secularized schools. He brought them out from under the rule of the Orthodox Church. So I mentioned a couple weeks ago that everybody in Russia is Eastern Orthodox, just like everybody in Italy and most of Europe was Catholic at the time. It was just something you grew up with, something you did. That's the case now. It wasn't necessarily the case back then. In Common Era 922, that is when Russia was officially founded, and that was the conversion of the Russian leader at the time to Orthodoxy, and that's been the official state religion, as it were, since that time. So the Orthodox Church was very much like the papacy in Italy, in the sense where it had immense power, it had immense reach. And one of the things that Peter, who was not a religious man himself, did was to distance a lot of the civic organizations and functions away from the grasp of the Orthodox Church. So he broke with the Orthodox Church by secularizing schools. He also broke with the Orthodox Church to bring art and philosophy into Russia. So art forms that had been forbidden by medieval Russian Orthodox Church, such as portraiture, instrumental music, and dramatic productions, began to enter the mainstream of the nation's cultural life. So to the point where by the mid-1700s, Russians were producing ballets, operas, chamber music, Baroque architecture, and novels. And of course, this is where we get the seeds of the Russian learned gentry, which is known as the intelligentsia. And these are a lot of the Russians that became the first indigenous Russian Masons. Another thing that Peter did that helped with the seeding of Masonry in Russia was he built the city of St. Petersburg. So Peter wanted to increase the standing of the Navy, modernize the Navy, and in order to do that, he needed what was called a warm water port. So he had some ports up in northern Russia, and then he also had the port of Vladivostok in eastern Russia. But the problem with those ports was they froze over during several months in the winter. So he was specifically looking for a warm water port that would afford him the ability to engage in commerce and trade with Europe year-round. And so he picked an abysmal swamp to build what would be the crowning achievement of his rule, which is the city of St. Petersburg. And that city, being a major port city, again became the seed, as we'll see, for early Russian Freemasonry. The issue there is that Peter did all of these great things, but then he passed away in 1725 without nominating an heir. The reforms of Peter the Great opened the door for the new class, as I've mentioned, which is the intelligentsia, Russians' artistic, intellectual, and philosophical elites. And they specifically, it enabled them to embrace the ideals of the European Enlightenment, which in turn made Russia that fertile ground in which Freemasonry could be planted.
Brother,
So go ahead.
I'm sorry. Earlier, you mentioned that initially, upon the introduction of Masonry into Russia, that there wasn't much of it didn't take too much, it didn't have much traction.
It didn't have much indigenous traction. The issue, the distinction there is that with Peter the Great's emphasis on modernization and Western culture, he invited Europeans in by the droves. They filled the ranks of his army. They filled the ranks of his navy. They were his closest advisors. They were his artists. They were his poets. They were his architects. So we had a massive influx of immigrants into Russia. And that is where Russian Freemasonry took hold, in those immigrants who brought them over, who brought the fraternity over from Europe, not with the indigenous Russian peoples.
And that influx of people, they were mostly higher class in the terms of those times, or?
Well, the higher class is more the oligarchy and the aristocracy. This was a new middle class, kind of the learned gentry, as you will. In Russia, you had very much a serf population. You had very much almost like a kind of caste system. It was very much a class system where you had slaves, you had serfs, you had tradesmen, then you had the learned gentry or the intelligentsia, then the aristocracy, and then the ruling class, which was, you know, the Tsars.
All right. Thank you, brother.
No problem. So getting into early Russian Freemasonry, which was predominantly a foreign influence, Peter's reforms directly enabled foreign Masonic influences to penetrate Russia. In building up the Navy, Peter paved the way for the hiring of foreigners into the steadily growing Russian Navy. In building up the port cities like St. Petersburg, he made Russian ports a center of commerce, which again attracted foreign merchants. And in opening up Russia to the arts, he set the groundwork for the formation of the Russian intelligentsia and the intellectual elite, which would resonate deeply with the ideals of Enlightenment philosophy. So in 1731, Freemasonry, we have the first record of Freemasonry actually being brought to Russia by foreign officers in the Russian service or the Russian armed forces. The Grand Lodge of England at this point appoints Captain John Phillips as a provincial Grand Master of Russia and Germany. Russia's ports, specifically St. Petersburg, were centers of immigration and consequently points of access for the influx of Masonry. The first lodge that was regularly founded in St. Petersburg in 1731 really only had Dutch and British members because, again, these were merchants who had settled in St. Petersburg. In 1740, according to the Grand Lodge of England minutes, James Keith, a general in the service of the Empress of Russia, who was Tsarina Anna Ivanovna, who I don't think I have a picture of. She ruled between 1730 and 1740. We actually had about 5 rulers in between the time of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, who each ruled for only about a decade, give or take, a couple of years. Because Peter, again, passed away without nominating an heir. But I'm passing over most of them just because they aren't that important to this story. So James Keith, general in the service of the Empress of Russia, received the appointment as a provincial Grand Master for Russia, replacing Captain Phillips. It's hard getting a picture of Captain Phillips now that movie has come out. I've been told there's no relation. But it's reported that Keith was a master of a lodge in St. Petersburg in the years 1732 to 1734. However, given the limits of historical knowledge, we don't actually have documents proving this. And much like his predecessor, we don't actually know what James Keith did as a provincial Grand Master. We just don't have records that indicate whether or not he actually was successful in growing Masonry in that country, or if it was just an honorary title bestowed upon him because he had dealings with Russia. The first lodge in Russia that we actually have documentation of outside of the one in St. Petersburg was established as early as 1742 and had 8 members at that point in a town called Wyszyniewiec, which is actually in modern-day Poland. There were a couple more that were established in Białystok, also in Poland. And between the 1740s and the early 1760s, you saw more and more lodges popping up around Russia and what is now Poland. And interesting, if you read the book Working the Rough Stone, it's an amazing history of this early age of Russian Freemasonry. The author, and I'm forgetting his name right now because I've got so much going on in this head of mine. The author actually mentions that based on some of the lodge records, these lodges weren't necessarily successful. They lived on for a couple of years and then died, and then it'd be restarted somewhere else. So, and this was very much a product of the fact that Freemasonry at this point in Russia had not taken a hold with the indigenous Russian population. So enter Empress Elizabeth, who's the daughter of Peter the Great. She starts getting wind of Freemasonry, and she's a little bit skeptical. So she's skeptical a little bit of her father's dealings with the West. She's worried about foreign influence. So she actually makes the first official inquiry into Russian Freemasonry in 1756. She made an inquiry into Russian Freemasonry, and the government actually was found not to be a part in any nefarious foreign activities. So Empress Elizabeth was allowed Freemasonry to continue, though under police surveillance. And during Elizabeth's reign, the Russian educated elite became more and more active in Freemasonry. So this is where we're really kind of seeing the transition period happen between Russian Freemasonry being a foreign institution, and then it getting and attracting more and more of the Russian aristocracy and intelligentsia. So Peter III takes the throne for about 6 months after Empress Elizabeth dies. And he is actually one of our first confirmed Russian ruling Freemasons. The German influence over Freemasonry in Russia actually expands a great deal at this point because of Peter III's very close ties to Frederick the Great. So Peter was a Prussophile through and through. He showed great reverence to Frederick the Great, who was a Freemason as well. And Peter III says it's rumored to be a Freemason himself, although I do think I have gotten that confirmed. There's so much going on right now. The deepening, but what you need to know is that the deepening German influence begins to inject what we know as the rite of strict observance, and also another lesser known rite called the Zinzendorf rite, into Russian Masonic culture. So you're starting to see some different branches of Freemasonry, specifically the differences between German and British Freemasonry taking hold in Masonic culture at this point in Russia. So Peter III passes away. Enter his wife, Catherine the Great. 1762. Catherine was one of Russia's great rulers, alongside of Peter the Great, really. She was originally very approving of Freemasonry. The first prominent Russian Freemason was Ivan Yelagin, who was a senator, a counselor, and belonged to an ancient family of Russian noblemen. And he was actually one of Catherine's confidants. So he was a close advisor to Catherine. And the fact that he was a Freemason, I think, helped bolster the fraternity in her eyes, at least at the very beginning of her reign. So in 1771, we have, the first officially constituted lodge in Russia, constituted from the Grand Lodge of England, and it's called Lodge of Peace and Fraternity. It received its warrant from the Grand Lodge of England on 1 June 1771. And of course, most of the members were English merchants at this time. Many Russian aristocrats were already Masons, having joined the fraternity during their travels in Europe during this time, where Freemasonry was evolving. And in 1772, Yelagin was appointed by the Grand Lodge of England as provincial Grand Master of the Empire of Russia. By 1774, Yelagin's lodges had a membership of over 200 Masons. And they were made up of Russian nobles and members from all levels of civil and military service. In that year, 5 Russian lodges were added to the Grand Lodge of England. And by 1777, the entire ruling class and state apparatus of Russia was thoroughly populated by Freemasons. So Yelagin really was the first man who royally kickstarted Freemasonry in Russia, and Freemasonry really blossomed and flourished under his reign his rule as provincial Grand Master. This is where we see the transition, under Yelagin's reign. Freemasonry really adopted the idea of speculative English Freemasonry, working with 3 degrees, trying to make each other better using Mason's tools. But there were some down the line who thought that it didn't go far enough. And this is where we get to Nikolai Novikov and the advent of higher degree Masonry, Swedish Rite Masonry, and Rosicrucianism. So in the early to mid 1770s, the Swedish Rite begins to take hold in Russia, turning Masonry away from the Hermetic and occult fascinations of the Enlightenment to a much more Christian-oriented approach to the fraternity. And here you're seeing a little bit of the start of the Russian aristocracy to turn away from the Enlightenment ideal. So you know what's going to happen in a couple years down the road with Freemasonry. Nikolai Novikov joined Freemasonry in St. Petersburg in 1775. He was a professor, and he was also a Rosicrucian, along with his fellow professor Johann Georg Schwartz. They transformed Russian Freemasonry from Yelagin's English speculative style into a highly dedicated and esoteric orders of Scottish Masonry, introducing closer bonds of secrecy and mutual obligation, special catechisms and vows, and new quasi-oriental costumes and rituals. So St. Petersburg, which was the seat of Yelagin's English 3-degree Masonry, actually remained that way, while Moscow, where Novikov was based, drifted much closer toward the higher degree of Masonry and Rosicrucian philosophy. At the same time, Novikov himself became much more active in politics and became criticized political factions that he saw as apostates. He's had specific beef with the Order of the Jesuits. The problem here is that he's a Freemason. He's an outspoken Freemason. He is starting to get a name for himself in politics. He had a Russian printing business. And he's starting to criticize some of the favorites of Catherine the Great. And this is where we see the turn of Catherine the Great from a favorable attitude toward Freemasonry to one of annoyance, disdain, and ultimately fear. So Catherine began to become more opposed to Freemasonry as Novikov kept on his tirade and crusades in the political arena. And one of the things that helped really cement the banning of Freemasonry, at least at its first point in Russia, was a gentleman by the name of Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, who we all know is one of the main proponents of the Egyptian rite of Masonry. So he visited Catherine the Great and brought with him the Egyptian rite of Masonry, which was contrary to anything Catherine had seen as far as Freemasonry goes up until that point. He initiated women into the order. His wife held seances. There was rampant sexual gratification within the order. And Catherine really turned her nose up at this and saw this as nothing but pure foolishness, to the point where in 1785 to 1786, she actually publicly ridiculed Masonic practices and practitioners. Her court produced 3 crudely satirical comedies called The Deceiver, The Deluded, and The Siberian Shaman, which were all aimed at ridiculing and making fun of Freemasonry, because at this point, Catherine wasn't able to separate the Egyptian rite of Masonry that Cagliostro was spoon-feeding her with the other factions of Freemasonry under Yelagin and Novikov. So Catherine's favor with Freemasonry further declined in the wake of the French Revolution in 1789 to 1790. And so Catherine had always been very, very open to Western ideals and to giving the people power. And so she saw the French Revolution specifically as a slap in the face to rulers who had tried to lift their people up. So she became increasingly hostile and paranoid toward the Enlightenment ideals that she had embraced at the beginning of her reign. The assassination of Gustav III and Louis XVI further reinforced that the people in the intelligentsia were simply not to be trusted. And in the early 1790s, Catherine began to administratively persecute Freemasons. One of the things that helped this along was the fact that her own son became a Freemason. Paul I, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, was initiated into Freemasonry in 1784. And as she began to administratively persecute the Freemasons, Paul actually turned against her a little bit, and she blamed the Freemasons for that divide in her relationship between her and her son. In 1792, after closing down a bunch of different Masonic printing presses, Catherine had Nikolai Novikov, again, our Rosicrucian friend who brought higher degree Masonry to Russia. She had him arrested and confiscated and burnt over 20,000 copies of Masonic works throughout Russia. And ultimately, she banned Freemasonry 2 years later in 1794, and lodges closed their doors all across Russia. So this ban really only stayed in place for 2 years because Catherine died in 1796, and Paul the First, of course, a Freemason himself, abolished all of the prison sentences imposed on the Freemasons and rewarded, protected, and even consulted them on state affairs. Although Freemasonry remained prohibited for a number of years until 1803, as we'll see. Russian Freemasonry, however, enjoyed a brief period of relatively unhampered existence in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And, you know, in 1803, Alexander the First, another rumored Freemason, although we have no historical evidence to support it, lifted the ban on Freemasonry. He is rumored to have taken the degrees in 1803, but like Peter the Great, I think that's much more just fancy and a bit of historical editing out of convenience sake, as opposed to something that has its basis in reality. But we don't know either way, and we're never going to know either way. So Alexander I lifted the ban on Freemasonry in 1803, and then in 1810 he actually specifically put out legislation that formally allowed the reestablishment of lodges in Russia. And I wish I could say everything was hunky-dory at this point, but it wasn't, because at this point in time, we had an era between 1810 and 1822 of competing Grand Lodges. We had the Directorial Lodge, which traced its authority back to Yelagin in St. Petersburg. Again, that 3-degree English speculative Masonry feel. And then you had the United Lodges of Alexander, Yelizaveta, and Peter, which was a contradictory style of Masonry. In 1815, Directorial Lodge disbanded and formed 2 Grand Lodges out of that, which were the Grand Directorial Lodge and the Grand Lodge of Astrea. Masonry tried to recover, but a new schism emerged among generational lines. And it's interesting, if you take a look at the schism that occurred in the first part of the 19th century in Russia, it's very much along some of the same lines that we're seeing in Freemasonry today. So the newer, younger Masonic brethren grew increasingly disillusioned with the higher degrees and argued for simplification. John, I'm reading that slide. And argued for simplification of Masonry back to its core tenets and the 3 foundational degrees. Again, you know, Masonry existing as a simple system of morality with 3 degrees. The older brethren who had already attained the higher degrees argued against the simplification of the rite. They liked their titles, they liked their higher degrees. Nevertheless, Masonry begins on the aggregate to shift back to that Yelagin system of 3 degrees. Now, after the Napoleonic Wars, revolutionary secret societies spread throughout Europe, which ultimately caused Alexander I in 1822 to again ban Freemasonry all out. It wasn't a ban specifically on Freemasonry. He simply banned all secret societies. The problem was Freemasonry was very much a secret society, or a society with secrets at this point. So Freemasonry was banned again. And interestingly enough, this banning coincided with the start of the Slavophile movement in Russia, which was, as I mentioned early on in the program, a rejection of Western values and institutions in favor of Russian cultural antiquity. So this ban was confirmed by Nicholas I in 1826 and signified the official end of Freemasonry in Russia, although clandestine lodges here and there continued to operate and fizzle out. But at this point, you know, all records cease. So we don't know who they were, we don't know what they did, and we don't know how they operated, because they operated very much in secrecy as a true secret society. So with the October Manifesto of 1905, so, you know, almost 80 years after Alexander I bans Freemasonry. The October Manifesto of 1905 proclaimed the right of meetings and unions. Representatives from Russian Freemasonry, or representatives of Russian Freemasonry, took advantage of this situation, and aided by the Council of the Grand Order of Eastern France, they reopened lodges in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And one of the biggest proponents of reopening lodges in St. Petersburg in Russia was Professor Maxim Kovalevsky, who tried to restart Freemasonry in Russia with the Grand Orient of France. This, of course, lasted until the Bolshevik Revolution, and in the early 1920s, Freemasonry again was outlawed by the Communist Party. And at this point, Russian Freemasons may have continued their activities in the country, but probably not, given the totalitarian nature of the communist government system. So really what you saw was a shift from Russian Freemasonry in Russia itself to Russian Freemasonry in exile in France. So Russian Freemasons continued their activities in exile, mainly in French lodges and Russian lodges in France. So that was the early 1920s. Fast forward to December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapses under Mikhail Gorbachev. And in 1992, the GLNF, Grand Lodge National Française, installs the first new Masonic lodge in Moscow after a long interruption, and then actually establishes 3 others in quick succession. So there's Harmony Lodge, Lotus Lodge, New Astria Lodge, and Gamayun Lodge. So Harmony and Lotus were in Moscow, New Astria was in St. Petersburg, and Gamayun was in Voronezh. And in 1995, the Grand Lodge of Russia, as we know it today, was established. Interestingly enough, the Grand Lodge of Russia was not without its growing pains and schisms. Based on their website in 2000, a large part of the brothers who disagreed with the internal policy of the Grand Lodge of Russia formed the Russian Regular Grand Lodge. Of course, I don't understand why clandestine organizations always put regular in their names, but here we have it again. But they merged in 2007 with the Grand Lodge of Russia again. So they remained clandestine for about 7 years, and then merged again with the Grand Lodge of Russia to form the United Grand Lodge of Russia. And with Freemasonry today, as it stands, we've got over 1,000 members in Russia proper, in 36 lodges across Russia. The Grand Lodge of Russia seems to be doing very, very well for itself. And the current Grand Master of Russia, who is Andrei Bogdanov, is actually the head of the Russian Democratic Party and ran for election against Putin. I believe he received like all of 1% of the vote. But Freemasonry is doing well in Russia. My concern going forward is that as you've seen, when Russia is aligning itself with the Western ideals and the Western institutions, Freemasonry does well. When it goes the opposite way, Freemasonry tends to get persecuted and banned. And so if we continue on the course that we're on, where we really have very much almost this new Cold War mentality between us and Russia, my concern is that we'll have increasing calls like this member of the Duma undertook to do formal inquiries into Russian Freemasonry to try to extricate any foreign influence. Because again, Freemasonry in Russia has been and will always continue to be connected with the West as a Western institution. So as far as the future of Freemasonry goes, it's, we'll have to see how our own relations as a country with Russia evolve over the next couple decades. But the hope is that Freemasonry is there to stay and is thriving. And that is about 286 years of Russian history in about 30 minutes. And I forgot to talk about the beard token.
You did.
Oh
What's
my,
the beard token?
Jason, you were muted all that time.
I was muted all that time.
Oh, wait. Can you start from the top?
Yes. So, what you need to know about Freemasonry in Russia is that Freemasonry is inherently a Western institution. I won't go back. I won't go through that all that again.
The LDR, yes.
I'll tell you,
However,
we had some
moving
brothers-
back to Peter the Great, one of the things that Robert Johnson came across a couple of years ago were these beard tokens, and these are really cool. These are one of the policies that Peter the Great enacted in Russia as part of his westernization and modernization kick was that he made Russians start dressing like Englishmen and Frenchmen, and that included shaving off their facial hair. So Russians typically, as part of the Slavic tribes, had very long, very full beards. We're talking like ZZ Top type of beard styles, and so Peter the Great made all of the Russian noblemen, especially, shave off all their beards. He did put in a provision, however, that said if you want to keep your beard, you have to pay a tax. And when you paid your tax, you got this beard token, which has the Romanov crest on the back of it. And as long as you had your beard token, you could keep your beard. So this is a replica of those tokens in solidarity of all of the wonderful men who have and retain facial hair. And it's just something funny and fun for us bearded folk.
But that gives me an idea. We should do that here in the U.S. with wearing your pants below your waist.
I thought you were going to stop at pants. I'm like,
The old pants tax. Remember that?
the old pants tax. Yes. We're going to go throw pants in the harbor.
There you go.
Yeah.
I did want to mention that for the duration of of your presentation, we had several brothers watching live, and they were very interested in the history. Very impressed with your knowledge about Russian history.
Despite the fact that I contradicted myself about 3 or 4 times as far as the first regularly established Russian lodges went. Is it 1731 in St. Petersburg? Is it 1742 in Poland? Oh, is it 1771? And that gets back to the limits of historical knowledge. We're working with competing sources and not enough sources. So for a large part, we'll never know at this point what actually happened. We can just give you our best guess as historians.
All right, Mike, Juan, you have any questions before we switch to social media?
I was wondering, I know you mentioned a little bit after the 1920s when they finally banned it again, but during the earlier times, do you think that they met in secret during those earlier eras when they had their lodges were banned?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, any time you get an official ban from the Russian aristocracy and Russian leadership, you have to close your doors. And that's exactly what they did when Catherine the Great banned them for the first time. She imprisoned a number of Freemasons, to include Nikolai Novikov. She shut down Masonic printing presses. She burned Masonic books. And at that point, lodges closed up shop. And of course, at that point, the records of Masonic lodges evaporated.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know if they simply went underground. My guess is it's a combination of the two. There were a couple diehard Masons that kept meeting in secret, but the vast majority of them said, this is too hot for my blood. We're done.
Okay. And then now I wonder this, and this could be a different tangent, so to speak, but when they started back up in 1905, do you kind of find that odd, since 2 years before was when the Russians actually published that false document of the Elders of Zion?
I don't know nearly as much about that document as I should.
Okay.
So I'm going to need more context behind that before I can give you a good answer on that question. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine.
So I think at this point, Freemasons, specifically in France, saw an opportunity and they tried to take it. It really was a target of opportunity with this 1905 edict, basically saying, you can have unions and you can have meetings and associations. And they said, "Oh yeah, well we're a fraternity, we're a club. We want to have meetings." And again, this is where you actually start seeing the Grand Orient of France and French Masonry's influence over Russian Freemasonry. That's actually an influence you feel very much today, because it was it was the Grand Lodge of France, the National Grand Lodge of France, that was the main driver in helping to reestablish the Grand Lodge of Russia in 1995. So if you look on their website, which is all in Russian, by the way, they actually have part of their history specifically devoted to the Grand Orient of France and the National Grand Lodge of France. So Russian Freemasons today are very cognizant of how indebted they are to French Freemasonry, carrying them through over 100 years of Masonic darkness, as it were, starting with the attempted revival of Freemasonry in 1905.
Great. So yeah, it's been light on the questions because this has been a one-way street. That's like watching the History Channel. So Jason, holy smokes, you knocked it out of the park.
I've been studying Russia for the better part of 15 years.
Yeah, kudos to you. You're now the new Nick Johnson. Congratulations.
Yeah, for anything Russia. Everything else, I'm useless.
As long as there are any questions about Russian Freemasonry.
I know a little bit about early Scottish Freemasonry.
You better by next week, right?
And by the end of next week, yes, I better know a lot. Still working on that.
To give a presentation up in Port Jervis Lodge.
Yeah.
There is one great meme from our friends over at Masonic Memes, shared to the Facebook event page for episode 161, where you guessed it, in Russian Masonry, light finds you.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I'm sorry if you're under the age of 30, you're not going to get the reference, but it's pretty funny.
Oh,
that's good.
Brothers, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier before I joined, but it is appropriate that we, express our sympathies and, for what's happening right now in St. Petersburg. We know that there was a suicide bomber in the metro, and some people lost their lives, and a lot of people were injured. But just the overall impact it has on the psyche of the community, that's something that we should keep our thoughts on. Keep our prayers for them.
Yeah, Russia is no stranger to extremism and terrorism, and they've been dealing with that since the early days of Vladimir Putin's reign back in the early 2000s, especially in Chechnya. So unfortunately, this is not commonplace at this point. However, they have had to deal with this before, and it's always gut-wrenching when it happens. So yes, our thoughts and prayers do go out to all of the brethren, especially in the St. Petersburg area.
Okay, so it's about that time. Let's start wrapping things up, and I will start with Mike the intern for his final thoughts. And any last questions for Jason?
No last questions, but I do want to say, man, it was great to listen to this whole thing. I mean, I was amazed just even looking at your notes, man. 5-6 pages worth. That was a lot. So great job.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Juan.
Yeah, there's definitely it is impressive, and we appreciate you taking the time to share all that with us. I just wanted to, we're running a little bit late tonight. I just wanted to briefly thank everybody for participating in the conversations, in the ongoing discussions that happen on every event. every time here on the Masonic Roundtable and on Facebook. And I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that we're almost at 10,000 likes on Facebook. So if you know of a brother who is not following our page, especially all of you brothers, think of that newer entered apprentice in your lodge. They might really enjoy a lot of the content that we've shared today. Just take a moment and grab the URL for the Facebook group and shoot an email to a brother or invite them. We'd like to see that. It's just metrics, it's just numbers, but it's pretty cool. 10,000, nice round figure. After that, we're gonna close it. Nobody else comes in, so get in. But that's it for me, brothers. And if you like Masonic Podcast, I have an episode coming up. I want to say towards the middle of next week, if the family gives me a little bit of time. We're gonna have a visit in town, so I have an episode coming up, and I'll let you know. thewindingstairs.com. Thank you, brothers.
And I'll see you Saturday, Juan.
I'll see you.
Ooh.
Jason, holy smokes. Fantastic job. What are your final thoughts? Because you haven't talked enough tonight.
So Andre Beliveau asked a question, and he asked if I had ever come across the presence or workings of other esoteric orders in Russia over the years, such as Golden Dawn, Martinism, Rosicrucian orders, etc. And do have to answer that one, which is not specific orders per se. However, we do know that in that Novikov era of Freemasonry in the 1780s, there was a huge emphasis on Martinism and Rosicrucianism. So I don't know what orders specifically that's referring to. However, they were very present, and they were enough to catch Catherine the Great's attention. So as far as my final thoughts are concerned, I feel like I just kind of vomited out history, and hopefully you all found it interesting. So let me know, because I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on it. Again, there are probably some things that I said that are open to debate just from the lack of historical sources. And unfortunately, when you get into the early history of Masonry, especially, you have to go with what you can and find sources and make logical leaps. So I'm going to be doing a lot of that over the next couple weeks, because a week from Friday, I'm speaking at Worshipful Andre Beliveau's Lodge, Port Jervis, up in Port Jervis, New York. And I am doing a brand new program that I'm debuting called Operative to Speculative, the Evolution of Early Scottish Freemasonry. So I am going all the way back to the 1020 Common Era and working my way up through over 700 years of operative and speculative Masonry in Scotland. And it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be absolutely crazy and intense. And there are some really, really interesting reasons as far as what necessitated the change and the evolution from operative Masonry to speculative Masonry in Scotland. So I'm looking forward to turning that into a paper or debuting that at other lodges as well. So come and check it out if you can, and hope to see you guys at some point. So next week, I think we decided we're going to take a bit of a breather. So don't look for episode 162 next week. We'll have it the week after. Don't worry. If you really want to torture yourself, just watch this episode again, because it'll put anybody to sleep. I've talked too much already, so I'm going to hand it back to John. I just appreciate you guys bearing with me for the past hour.
We gave you a platform, so that's amazing. Again, I knew very, very little, extremely little, about Russian culture in general, Russian history in general, and Masonry therein. So, Jason, I was just enthralled at the context that you put everything in. So, again, thank you very, very much. And I'll close by saying that for all of you new Masons looking for education, congratulations, you have now a free educational topic that you can cut. You can fast forward past the Masonic news. You can show this in your lodge room, and this could be a piece of Masonic history, Masonic education. It's out there. Go look for it. But here it is, something we try to provide for free every week, and Jason just knocked it out of the park. That being said, Jason will also travel to your lodge and give this in person, of which he will certainly add in some of the Master Mason only references, as well as more research as it develops. So this is only a snapshot in time, but if you want the real deal, you can go over to our speaking engagements page and reach out to us. And if it's reasonable, we'll try to make it over to your lodge. So,
and if it's not, Skype us in. We'll do it virtually.
Right. There you go.
We can do that easy and free.
Easy and free. Easy peasy.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks again, Jason. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Thank you for watching, whether live or later. So we'll see you not next week, but the week after. Thanks very much for watching, and keep searching for more light. Have a good night.